the refusal to treat people with dignity. And I think that's really why we're here today. The deplorable conditions dehumanize those incarcerated in the eyes of those charged with their care. There is a connection between the rotten food, the lack of medical care, the dirtiness of the space, the overcrowding, and those acts of violence. Mr. Mayer came to the jail with a neurological condition that he's had for his whole life that causes twitching and muscle spasms, similar in kind to Tourette's. It is part of his medical reality, and when he was booked into the jail, he was eventually housed in the specialized medical unit. And as the complaint describes, it was in that medical unit when he was receiving medication from a jail nurse that he experienced a slight tremor as the nurse was putting a pill into his hand. This was almost 1 year ago today. At that time, Corrections Officer Daryl Hayes, as the complaint describes, grabbed Mr. Mayer by the back of the neck and squeezed hard. Mr. Mayer's spasms can be triggered by that kind of contact or by anxiety, and Hayes' contact with him triggered a very intense muscle spasm, at which point Hayes elbowed him in the back and continued to squeeze his neck hard. Even as the nurse who had been administering Mr. Mayer's medication expressed to Hayes to stop and explained the condition that he was in, even then Hayes didn't stop immediately. And when he did, he joked about how he's used to choking people out in here. Hayes was not disciplined for this conduct, and he claimed when he was being interviewed by the investigator within the jail to not even remember Mr. Mayer 2 days after the incident occurred. Mr. Mayer's resulting symptoms manifested over the coming days, and he progressively deteriorated. Before the incident, he was completely mobile, able to walk. From 2 days after the event onward, he was unable to walk. His symptoms continued to go downhill, and he was eventually taken to Metro Health. He has spent months in a wheelchair, and now, as you see, he is using a walker to aid in his mobility. It wasn't as though Cuyahoga County had no idea that this particular corrections officer was a problem. As the complaint describes, Defendant Hayes has had significant criticism of his performance documented in his personnel file, and it begs the question why he was left loose in the jail, particularly in a specialized medical unit. Some quotes from Defendant Hayes' personnel performance evaluations. Quote, "Officer Hayes needs to understand that he could not beat everyone in his housing unit," end quote. He was criticized for being, quote, "harsh and threatening with his inmates." His judgment was questioned repeatedly, as was his professionalism. Defendant Hayes has 8 formal personnel actions documented in his personnel records that the county has provided in response to public records requests submitted on behalf of Mr. Mayer, including for falling asleep on duty, tardiness, giving special treatment to an inmate, and he was also criticized for inappropriate social media posts where he called inmates, quote, "monsters," and also, quote, "I always say I hate inmates." One additional quote from Mr. Hayes' Facebook page is, quote, "I will now refer to pepper spray as people seasoning in my reports." This is apparently what passes for humor at the Cuyahoga County Corrections Center. What happened to Mr. Mayer is terrible. It's terrible standing alone as its own incident. But when you look at it in the context of all of the other incidences of abuse that have happened in this facility in the past few years, it's really not surprising. As you see in the complaint, and as you've seen from the coverage throughout the area, one after another, people are coming forward and telling their stories of having been abused within the county jail. And unfortunately, it doesn't appear that the county jail has adequately preserved the evidence of these acts of violence. Repeatedly, we've requested that the video of the attack that Mr. Mayer endured be provided. The county has refused to produce it, claiming such doesn't exist. Now, where Mr. Mayor was standing at the time of the attack by Corrections Officer Hayes, there should be at least 2 camera views of that space. But yet they claim it doesn't exist and that there's no video evidence of this attack. Combine this with other concerns about the record keeping and the preservation of public records at the county jail. FBI agent Dennis Timoney testified in a trial a few weeks ago, a criminal matter against 2 corrections officers accused of assaulting an inmate. FBI agent testified that there was evidence of deletion of videos in the jail, raised concerns about naming conventions and renaming videos such that they couldn't be retrieved. Recently, Special Assistant Ohio Attorney General discovered when visiting the county headquarters that certain records that had previously existed had been deleted despite a judge's order to the contrary in a pending criminal matter. We have also seen an indicted Corporal, Idris Fareed Clark, threatening other corrections officers and if they don't testify on his behalf, and offering to delete videos of the other corrections officers abusing inmates in the jail. This is very, very concerning, and Mr. Mayor is pursuing a claim for destruction of public records regarding the video that should have existed of what happened to him last October. We're going to give Mr. Mayor the floor for a bit. I expect that you'll hear him talk about how he calls on those responsible for his injuries to accept responsibility. And that would include Corrections Officer Hayes, as well as those who let Hayes work as a CO, those who fostered and facilitated and encouraged the entrenched culture of indiscriminate violence at the jail. They need to take responsibility for the harm that they've caused. And if they're not willing to, we will hold them accountable. I'm going to give Mr. Mayor a few minutes to speak, and then I'll answer any questions that you may have about the suit.
Well, thank you for coming. My name is Glenn Mayer. And this does get really hard for me to talk about. So if you could bear with me. Like pretty much everyone who ended up in the county jail, I've committed crimes. But even though we've all committed crimes, we're still human beings. And the jail needs to treat us like human beings. After a guard attacked me last October, I woke up on the floor of my cell. I couldn't feel anything or move anything on my whole left side. I was scared. I was scared because I didn't know what was happening. No one was explaining anything. No one told me what was going on. I was crying and asking what was going on, but no one seemed to care. They just put me in a corner and went on with their time. It was painful, but keeping me in the dark made it even worse. I really hurt and scared me because I had to sit there and wait for them to get permission to even put me in an ambulance.